Chapter 2. There is little to interest in the narrative of early childhood, unless indeed one were writing on education. We shall not, therefore, linger over the infancy of the motherless boy left to the protection of Mrs. Marjorie Lobkins, or, as she was sometimes familiarly called, Peggy or Piggy Lob. The good dame, drawing a more than sufficient income from the profits of a house which, if situated in an obscure locality, enjoyed very general and lucrative repute, and being a lone widow without kith or kin, had no temptations to break her word to the deceased, and she suffered the orphan to wax in strength and understanding until the age of 12, a period at which we are now about to reintroduce him to our readers. The boy evinced great hardihood of temper, and no inconsiderable quickness of intellect. In whatever he attempted, his success was rapid, and a remarkable strength of limb and muscle seconded well the dictates of an ambition turned, it must be confessed, rather to physical than mental exertion. It must not be supposed, however, that his boyish life passed in unbroken tranquillity. Although Mrs. Lobkins was a good woman on the whole, and greatly attached to her protégé, she was violent and rude in temper, or, as she herself more flatteringly expressed it, her feelings were uncommonly strong. And alternate quarrel and reconciliation constituted the chief occupations of the protégé's domestic life. As, previous to his becoming the ward of Mrs. Lobkins, he had never received any other appellation than the child, so the duty of christening him devolves upon our hostess of the mug, and, after some deliberation, she blessed him with the name of Paul. It was a name of happy omen, for it happened to belong to Mrs. Lobkins' grandfather, who had been 3 times transported and twice hanged. At the first occurrence of the latter description, he had been restored by the surgeons, much to the chagrin of a young anatomist who was to have had the honor of cutting him up. The boy did not seem likely to merit the distinguished appellation he bore, for he testified no remarkable predisposition to the property of other people. Nay, although he sometimes emptied the pockets of any stray visitor to the coffee-room of Mrs. Lobkins, it appeared an act originating rather in a love of the frolic than a desire of the profit. For, after the plundered person had been sufficiently tormented by the loss, haply of such utilities as a tobacco-box or a handkerchief, after he had, to the secret delight of Paul, searched every corner of the apartment, stamped and fretted and exposed himself by his petulance to the bitter objurgation of Mrs. Lobkins, our young friend would quietly and suddenly contrive that the article missed should return of its own accord to the pocket from which it had disappeared. And thus, as our readers have doubtless experienced, when they have disturbed the peace of a whole household for the loss of some portable treasure which they themselves are afterwards discovered to have mislaid, the unfortunate victim of Paul's honest ingenuity, exposed to the collected indignation of the spectators, and sinking from the accuser into the convicted, secretly cursed the unhappy lot which not only vexed him with the loss of his property, but made it still more annoying to recover it. Whether it was that, on discovering these pranks, Mrs. Lobkins trembled for the future bias of the address they displayed, or whether she thought that the folly of thieving without gain required speedy and permanent correction, we cannot decide. But the good lady became at last extremely anxious to secure for Paul the blessings of a liberal education. The key of knowledge, the art of reading, she had, indeed, 2 years prior to the present date, obtained for him. But this far from satisfied her conscience. Nay, she felt that, if she could not also obtain for him the discretion to use it, it would have been wise even to have withheld a key which the boy seemed perversely to apply to all locks but the right one. In a word, she was desirous that he should receive an education far superior to those whom he saw around him, and attributing, like most ignorant persons, 2 great advantages to learning, she conceived that, in order to live as decorously as the parson of the parish, it was only necessary to know as much Latin. One evening in particular, as the dame sat by her cheerful fire, this source of anxiety was unusually active in her mind, and ever and anon she directed unquiet and restless glances towards Paul, who sat on a form at the opposite corner of the hearth, diligently employed in reading the life and adventures of the celebrated Richard Turpin. The form on which the boy sat was worn to a glassy smoothness, save only in certain places where some ingenious idler or another had amused himself by carving sundry names, epithets, and epigrammatic niceties of language. It is said that the organ of carving upon wood is prominently developed on all English skulls, and the sagacious Mr. Combe has placed this organ at the back of his head in juxtaposition to that of destructiveness, which is equally large among our countrymen, as is notably evinced upon all railings, seats, temples, and other things belonging to other people. Opposite to the fireplace was a large deal table, at which Dummie, surnamed Dunaker, seated near the dame, was quietly ruminating over a glass of Hollands and water. Farther on, at another table in the corner of the room, a gentleman with a red wig, very rusty garments, and linen which seemed as if it had been boiled in saffron, smoked his pipe, apart, silent, and apparently plunged in meditation. This gentleman was no other than Mr. Peter McGrawler, the editor of a magnificent periodical entitled The Athenaeum, which was written to prove that whatever is popular is necessarily bad, a valuable and recondite truth, which the Athenaeum had satisfactorily demonstrated by ruining 3 printers and demolishing a publisher. We need not add that Mr. McGrawler was Scotch by birth, since we believe it is pretty well known that all periodicals of this country have, from time immemorial, been monopolized by the gentleman from the land of cakes. We know not how it may be the fashion to eat the said cakes in Scotland, but here the good emigrators seem to like them carefully buttered on both sides. By the side of the editor stood a large pewter tankard. Above him hung an engraving of the wonderfully fat boar, formerly in the possession of Mr. Fathom, grazier. To his left rose the dingy form of a thin, upright clock in an oaken case. Beyond the clock, a spit and a musket were fastened in parallels to the wall. Below these twin emblems of war and cookery were 4 shelves, containing plates of pewter and delf, and terminating, centaur-like, in a sort of dresser. At the other side of these domestic conveniences was a picture of Mrs. Lobkins, in a scarlet body and a hat and plume. At the back of the fair hostess stretched a blanket we have mentioned before. As a relief to the monotonous surface of this simple screen, various ballads and learned legends were pinned to the blanket. There you might read in verses, pathetic and unadorned, how Sally loved a sailor lad, as fought with famous shovel. There you might learn, if of 2 facts so instructive you were before unconscious, that Ben the Topper loved his bottle, Charlie only loved the lasses. When of these and various other poetical effusions you were somewhat wearied, the literary fragments, in humbler prose, afforded you equal edification and delight. There might you fully enlighten yourself as to the strange and wonderful news from Kensington, being a most full and true relation, how a maid there is supposed to have been carried away by an evil spirit on Wednesday, 15th of April last, about midnight. There, too, no less interesting and no less veracious, was that uncommon anecdote touching the chief of many throned powers, entitled The Divil of Mascom, or the true relation of the chief things which an unclean spirit did and said at Mascom in Burgundy, in the house of one Mr. Francis Perrot, now made English by one that hath a particular knowledge of the truth of the story. Nor were these materials for satanic history the only prosaic and faithful chronicles which the bibliothecal blanket afforded. Equally wonderful, and equally indisputable, was the account of a young lady, the daughter of a duke, with 3 legs and the face of a porcupine. No less so, the awful judgment of God upon swearers, as exemplified in the case of John Stiles, who dropped down dead after swearing a great oath, and on stripping the unhappy man, they found "Swear not at all" written on the tail of his shirt. Twice had Mrs. Lobkins heaved a long sigh, as her eyes turned from Paul to the tranquil countenance of Dummie Duneker, and now, resettling herself in her chair, as a motherly anxiety gathered over her visage. "Paul, my ben cull," she said, "what gibberish has got there?" "Turpin, the great highwayman," answered the young student, without lifting his eyes from the page, through which he was spelling his instructive way. "Oh, he be's a chip of the right block, dame," said Mr. Duneker, as he applied his pipe to an illuminated piece of paper. "He'll ride a 'oss followed by a haycorn yet, I warrants." To this prophecy the dame replied only with a look of indignation, and rocking herself to and fro in her huge chair, she remained for some moments in silent thought. At last she again wistfully eyed the hopeful boy, and calling him to her side, communicated some order in a dejected whisper. Paul, on receiving it, disappeared behind the blanket, and presently returned with a bottle and a wine-glass. With an abstracted gesture, and an air that betokened continued meditation, the good dame took the inspiring cordial from the hand of her youthful cup-bearer. And ere a man had power to say behold, the jaws of Lobkins had devoured it up. So quick, bright things come to confusion. The nectarian beverage seemed to operate cheerily on the matron's system, and placing her hand on the boy's curly head, she said, "Like Andromache, da cruan glasasa, or a Scot hath it," with a smile in her cheek, but a tear in her eye. "Paul, thy heart be good, thy heart be good. Thou didst not spill a drop of the tape. Tell me, my honey, why didst thou lick Tom Tobyson?" "Because," answered Paul, "he said as how you ought to have been hanged long ago." "Tom Tobyson is a good for naught," returned the dame, "and deserves to shove the tumbler. But, oh my child, be not too venturesome in taking up the sticks for a blowin'. It has been the ruin of many a man afore you, and when 2 men goes to quarrel for a woman, they doesn't know the nature of the thing they quarrels about. Mind thy latter end, Paul, and reverence the old, without axing what they has been before they passed into the vale of years. Thou mayest get me my pipe, Paul. It is upstairs under my pillow." While Paul was accomplishing his errand, the lady of the mug, fixing her eyes upon Mr. Duneker, said, "Dummie, Dummie, if little Paul should come to be scragged." "Whish!" muttered Dummie, glancing over his shoulder to McGrawler. "Mayhap that gentleman—" Here his voice became scarcely audible, even to Mrs. Lobkins, but his whisper seemed to imply an insinuation that the illustrious editor of the Athenaeum might be either an informer or one of those heroes on whom an informer subsists. Mrs. Lobkins' answer, couched in the same key, appeared to satisfy Duneker, for, with a look of great contempt, he chucked up his head and said, "Oho, that be all, be it?" Paul here reappeared with the pipe, and the dame, having filled the tube, leaned forward and lighted the Virginian weed from the blower of Mr. Duneker. As in this interesting occupation the heads of the hostess and the guest approached each other, the glowing light playing cheerily on the countenance of each, there was an honest simplicity in the picture that would have merited the racy and vigorous genius of a Cruikshank. As soon as the Promethean spark had been fully communicated to the lady's tube, Mrs. Lobkins, still possessed by the gloomy idea she had conjured up, repeated, "Ah, Dummie, if little Paul should be scragged." Dummie, withdrawing the pipe from his mouth, heaved a sympathizing puff, but remained silent. And Mrs. Lobkins, turning to Paul, who stood with mouth open and ears erect at this boding ejaculation, said, "Dost think, Paul, they'd have the heart to hang thee?" "I think they'd have the rope, dame," returned the youth. "But you need not go for to run your neck into the noose," said the matron, and then, inspired by the spirit of moralizing, she turned round to the youth and, gazing upon his attentive countenance, accosted him with the following admonitions. Mind thy catechism, child, and reverence old age. Never steal, especially when anyone be in the way. Never go snacks with them as be older than you. 'Cause why? The older a cove be, the more he cares for hisself, and the less for his partner. At 20, we diddles the public. At 40, we diddles our cronies. Be modest, Paul, and stick to your situation in life. Go not with fine tobymen, who burn out like a candle what has a thief in it, all flare and gone in a whiffy. Leave liquor to the aged, who can't do without it. Tape often proves a halter, and there be's no ruin like blue ruin. Read your Bible and talk like a pious one. People goes more by your words than your actions. If you wants what is not your own, try to do without it, and if you cannot do without it, take it away by insinuation, not bluster. They as swindles does more and risks less than they as robs, and if you cheats toppingly, you may laugh at the topping cheat. And now go and play. Paul seized his hat, but lingered, and the dame, guessing at the significance of the pause, drew forth and placed in the boy's hand the sum of 5 halfpence and 1 farthing. There, boy, quoth she, and she stroked his head fondly when she spoke. You does right not to play for nothing. It's loss of time. But play with those as be less than yourself, and then you can go for to beat 'em if they says you go for to cheat. Paul vanished, and the dame, laying her hand on Dummie's shoulder, said, There be nothing like a friend in need, Dummie, and somehow or other, I thinks as how you knows more of the horigin of that here lad than any of us. Me, dame? Exclaimed Dummie, with a broad gaze of astonishment. Ah, you knows as how the mother saw more of you just afore she died than she did of either one of us. Know her now, tell us all about un. Did she steal un, think ye? Lauk, Mother Margery, dost think I knows? What put such a crotchet in your head? Well, said the dame with a disappointed sigh, I always thought as how you were more known about it than you owns. Dear, I shall never forget the night when Judith brought the poor creature here. You knows she had been some months in my house afore ever I seen the urchin, and when she brought it, she looked so pale and ghostly that I had not the heart to say a word. So I stared at the brat, and it stretched out its wee little hands to me, and the mother frowned at it and throwed it into my lap. Ah, she was a hawful woman, that hare, said Dummie, shaking his head, but howsomever the hurchin fell into good hands, for I be's sure you has been a better mother to her than the real one. I was always a fool about childer, rejoined Mrs. Lobkins, and I thinks as how little Paul was sent to be a comfort to my later end. Fill the glass, Dummie. I's heard as how Judith was once blowin' to a great lord, said Dummie. Like enough, returned Miss Lobkins, like enough. She was always a favourite of mine, for she had a spirit as big as my own, and she paid her rent like a decent body, for all she was out of her senses or a nation like it. Aye, I knows as how you liked her, 'cause why, 'tis not your way to let a room to a woman. You says as how 'tis not respectable, and you only likes men to visit the mug. And I doesn't like all of them as comes here, answered the dame, especially for Paul's sake. But what can a lone woman do? Many's the gentleman highwayman what comes here, whose money's as good as the clerk's of the parish. And when a bob is in my hand, what does it signify whose hand it was in afore? That's what I call being sensible and practical, said Dummie approvingly. And after all, though you has a mixture like, I does not know a halehouse where a cove is better entertained, nor meets of a Sunday more elegant company than the mug. Here the conversation, which the reader must know had been sustained in a key inaudible to a third person, received a check from Mr. Peter McGrawler, who, having finished his reverie and his tankard, now rose to depart. First, however, approaching Mrs. Lobkins, he observed that he had gone on credit for some days, and demanded the amount of his bill. Glancing towards certain chalk hieroglyphics inscribed on the wall at the other side of the fireplace, the dame answered that Mr. McGrawler was indebted to her for the sum of 1 shilling and 9 pence 3 farthings. After a short preparatory search in his waistcoat pockets, the critic hunted into one corner a solitary half-crown, and having caught it between his finger and thumb, he gave it to Mrs. Lobkins and requested change. As soon as the matron felt her hand anointed with what has been called by some ingenious Johnson of St. Giles the oil of palms, her countenance softened into a complacent smile, and when she gave the required change to Mr. McGrawler, she graciously hoped as how he would recommend the mug to the public. "That you may be sure of," said the editor of the Athenaeum. "There is not a place where I am so much at home." With that, the learned Scotsman buttoned his coat and went his way. "How spiteful the world be," said Mrs. Lobkins after a pause, "especially if a woman keeps a fashionable sort of a public. When Judith died, Joe, the dog's meat man, said I were all the better for it, and that she left I a treasure to bring up the urchin. One would think a thumper makes a man richer, 'cause why, every man thumps. I got nothing more than a watch and 10 guineas when Judy died, and sure that scarce paid for the burial." "You forgets the 2 quids I give you for the whole box of rags. Much of a treasure I found there," said Dummie, with sycophantic archness. "Ay," cried the dame, laughing, "I fancies you were not pleased with the bargain. I thought you were too old a rag merchant to be so free with the blunt. Howsomever, I suppose it war the tinsel petticoat as took you in." "As it has many a wiser man than the like of I," rejoined Dummie, who, to his various secret professions, added the ostensible one of a rag merchant and dealer in broken glass. The recollection of a good bargain in the box of rags opened our landlady's heart. "Drink, Dummie," she said good-humouredly. "Drink. I scorns to score lush to a friend." Dummie expressed his gratitude, refilled his glass, and the hospitable matron, knocking out from her pipe the dying ashes, thus proceeded. "You sees, Dummie, though I often beats the boy, I loves him as much as if I were his rale mother. I wants to make him an honour to his country and an exception to my family." "Who all flashed their ivories at Surgeon's Hall," added the metaphorical Dummie. "True," said the lady, "they died game, and I bean't ashamed of 'em. But I owes a duty to Paul's mother, and I wants Paul to have a long life. I would send him to school, but Hugh knows as how the boys only corrupt one another. And so I should like to meet with some decent man, as a tutor, to teach the lad Latin and virtue." "My eyes!" cried Dummie, aghast at the grandeur of this desire. "The boy is cute enough, and he loves reading," continued the dame, "but I does not think the books he gets hold of will teach him the way to grow old." "And how came he to read anyhows?" "Ranting Rob, the strolling player, taught him his letters, and said he'd a deal of genius." "And why should not Ranting Rob teach the boy Latin and virtue?" "'Cause Ranting Rob, poor fellow, was lagged for doing a penny," answered the dame despondently. There was a long silence. It was broken by Mr. Dummie, slapping his thigh with the gesticulatory vehemence of an ugofoscolo. That gentleman exclaimed, "I has it! I has thought of a tutor for leetle Paul." "Who's that? You quite frightens me. You has no marcy on my narves," said the dame fretfully. "Why, it be the gemman what writes," said Dummie, putting his finger to his nose. "The gemman what paid you so flashly." "What, the Scotch gemman?" "The wery same," returned Dummie. The dame turned in her chair and refilled her pipe. It was evident from her manner that Mr. Dunniker's suggestion had made an impression on her, but she recognized 2 doubts as to its feasibility. One, whether the gentleman proposed would be adequate to the task. The other, whether he would be willing to undertake it. In the midst of her meditations on this matter, the dame was interrupted by the entrance of certain claimants on her hospitality, and Dummie soon after taking his leave, the suspense of Mrs. Lobkins' mind touching the education of little Paul remained the whole of that day and night utterly unrelieved.